My name is Evelyn Rowe. I'm 58 years old. The house smelled like rosemary and money, both of which my daughter had in abundance. Lauren's new place in Ardsley Park looked like something from a magazine spread, white marble counters. Champagne flutes lined perfectly, the kind of silverware that feels too cold in your hands. I stood near the end of the long dining table, smoothing the linen napkin on my lap while conversations swirled around me like polished glass. Mark, her husband, poured more wine for the guests, smiling the way realtors do practiced. A little hollow, Lauren's laugh rang out from across the table, bright and brittle. The chandelier above us reflected tiny suns in every glass. I'd brought my pecan pie, still warm from the oven, the one I'd baked for Thanksgiving since she was 10. No one had touched it yet. I told myself not to take it personally. Halfway through dinner, someone asked about the photo hanging in the hallway, the one of Lauren as a little girl, sitting on her father's shoulders at Tybee Beach. I smiled before I could stop myself. David always said she could outswim the tide, I began. One summer she tried to chase a shrimp boat all the way out. He had to wade in after her, still wearing his shoes. He never let her forget it. A few polite laughs rose from the table, thin as tissue. Lauren's fork clicked against her plate. "Mom," she said lightly, without looking up. "That's not really dinner talk." I hesitated, the story still halfway on my tongue. "It's just a memory," I said, softer now. Her voice sharpened. "Seriously, Mom, can we not? Nobody cares." The words didn't echo. They landed flat, final. I felt them settle into the quiet that followed, heavy and cold. The clatter of cutlery stopped. Even the children froze, their eyes darting from her to me. For a second, I thought I might laugh just to break the silence, but my throat wouldn't work. I folded the napkin in my lap, aligning the corners. My hands didn't shake. I rose slowly, pushing my chair back with the gentlest scrape against the hardwood floor. "I think I'll get some air," I said. My voice sounded calm, almost pleasant. No one stopped me. Lauren lifted her glass to her lips, pretending to sip. Mark reached for the gravy boat, pretending not to notice. The hallway was warm, the kind of heat that comes from too many candles and too little sincerity. As I passed the mirror by the entryway, I caught my reflection pearls, pale sweater, hair pinned neatly at the nape of my neck. I looked like a guest who'd stayed too long, outside. The evening air felt merciful. The porch lights glowed across the neighborhood, each one marking a family gathered behind closed doors. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool scent of pine and roasted turkey drifting from other homes. My own car waited at the curb, its paint dull under the street lamp. Inside, laughter resumed, careful at first, then louder, like a song that didn't need me to keep time. Through the window, I saw Lauren leaning into Mark's shoulder, smiling at something one of the guests said. Her gestures were elegant, effortless, the way she always wanted to be. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking softly on the stone path. The sound steadied me. When I reached the car, I placed my hand on the cold metal of the door and exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The pie sat on the passenger seat, covered with a towel embroidered with little orange leaves. I rested my hand on it for a moment before starting the engine. The headlights washed over the manicured lawn, then swept across the front window where my daughter still sat laughing. The house looked warm and golden, like something from a life I'd already left behind. As I turned onto Victory Drive, the street lamps flickered through the windshield light. Shadow, light, shadow, like the rhythm of a decision forming in silence. The hum of the engine filled the car, a steady companion. I didn't look back. By the time I crossed the bridge toward downtown Savannah, the tide was rolling in under the dark water, strong and certain. I tightened my grip on the wheel and drove on, the road stretching ahead in quiet, endless silver. The roads were empty, slick with the fine mist that Savannah carries like a secret. Streetlights blurred into ribbons of pale gold across my windshield. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, following the familiar route through Ardsley Park toward the river, though I could barely see the lines on the road. The radio murmured softly, an old gospel station fading in and out of static. It was something to fill the quiet. My throat burned, not from tears, because none came, but from the effort of holding them back. I'd sat through years of exhaustion, funerals, births, shifts that began before dawn and ended after dark, but nothing had prepared me for that moment. My daughter's voice slicing cleanly through a room full of laughter, telling me to shut up as if I were a stranger. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in rhythm with my thoughts, relentless and mechanical. I tried to replay the evening as if I could edit it, smooth the edges, rewrite her words into something softer. But the more I tried, the louder they rang. Nobody cares. By the time I reached my street, the mist had thickened into fog. The oak trees loomed above the sidewalks, draped in silver moss, their shadows trembling in the light. My small brick house looked the same as it always had, quiet, neat, unremarkable. A porch light glowed above the steps, left on out of habit, the way I used to leave it for Lauren when she was in high school and came home late from practice. Inside, the air was still. The faint scent of lavender hung in the hallway from the sachets I kept in the dresser. I slipped off my heels at the door, the sound of them against the floor sharp in the silence. My purse landed on the console table with a soft thud. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, steady and low, a kind of pulse in the quiet. I stood there for a long moment, listening to it, the sound oddly comforting. Then I unclasped my pearls, the same ones David had given me the year Lauren was born, and placed them carefully in the blue ceramic dish by the sink, in the living room. His photograph waited on the mantel, David in his Coast Guard uniform, eyes bright, the river wind lifting his hair. I sat across from it, elbows on my knees, palms pressed together. "You would have laughed," I whispered. "You'd have told me to let her grow up, to stop worrying." My voice cracked, but you'd have heard the way she said it. You'd have known it wasn't just a bad moment. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. I rubbed my hands together, the skin dry and cold. Around me, the house settled, old wood creaking, pipes sighing as if exhaling after holding its breath. I looked at the framed photo of Lauren as a child beside David's, her small hand tucked in his, both of them looking toward the surf. Somewhere between the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ring of the clock, the shock began to harden into something clearer. Not anger, not yet, just the cold. Certain understanding that something inside the life I'd built had quietly cracked. I rose and turned off the porch light, though it had been burning for years. Then I stood by the window, watching the fog roll in from the river until the street disappeared completely from view. The morning David died began like any other coffee percolating. The newspaper folded neatly beside his plate. He had kissed my cheek, promised to be home before dinner, and left for a routine patrol off the coast. By evening, the chaplain and another officer stood on my porch, their uniforms still damp from rain. I remember the umbrella trembling in my hand, the world narrowing to the words, "cardiac arrest on duty." Everything after that blurred: the phone calls, the casserole dishes, the murmured condolences. I sat in our living room surrounded by people. Yet the only sound I heard was the ticking of the wall clock. Each second marked the distance between the life I had known and the one I was about to face. When the last guest left and the house fell silent, I locked myself in the bathroom and pressed my forehead to the cool tile. Lauren was 10, and she had David's eyes, the same gray-green that seemed to change with the weather. When she asked where he'd gone, I told her, out to sea. It was the only truth I could manage. That night, I stood in her doorway, watching her sleep. Her hair had fallen across her face, and her hand rested on the pillow, where she'd drawn his picture in crayon, a stick figure with a wide smile and a blue hat. My throat ached as I whispered, "You'll never go without, I promise." The promise was simple when I said it, but it grew teeth over the years. I sold David's boat first, then his tools, keeping only the watch he wore on duty. The Coast Guard pension barely covered rent. So I took every shift I could at Memorial Hospital. I learned to run on black coffee and stubbornness. There were nights I came home so tired I sat on the kitchen floor, still in uniform, too weary to undress. But the next morning, I went back. Lauren adjusted quickly. She was bright, graceful, hungry to please. She never complained about the small apartment or the thrift store clothes. I saved every extra dollar in a plain white envelope labeled Future Fund. When she brought home her first report card filled with A's, I taped it to the refrigerator like a medal. On Sundays, I'd take her to the riverfront. We'd sit on the same worn bench David had built from driftwood. Sometimes, when the light hit the water just right, she'd squint and say she could see his boat on the horizon. I'd nod and tell her to wave, pretending I saw it too. Years slipped by in that rhythm work. Save, dream. The city around us changed, stores closed, new ones opened, neighbors moved away. I barely noticed. My world had shrunk to the size of that promise. Make her safe. Make her proud. Make sure she never feels the cold edge of want. When Lauren graduated high school, she wore the same pearl earrings I'd worn on my wedding day. As she walked across the stage, I felt David's absence like a physical weight beside me. I thought of that night by her doorway, the vow whispered into the dark. I had kept it. Every exhausting, lonely inch of it. After the ceremony, she hugged me hard. "You did everything, Mom," she said. I smiled and told her, "That's what mothers do." What? But inside, something quieter answered. "That's what I do because I don't know how to stop." I still have David's watch. It stopped years ago, frozen at 2:17 p.m., the time the chaplain said his heart gave out. I keep it in my dresser, next to the envelope that became a savings account, then a fund, then a down payment on my daughter's future. The watch doesn't tick anymore, but the promise does. The years that followed blurred into a rhythm of hospital corridors and the soft hiss of oxygen machines. I was 32 when I learned how to sleep, sitting up, one arm draped over a chart, my head pressed against a folded jacket in the staff lounge. At Memorial Hospital, they used to joke that I was part of the night shift furniture. I smiled at that. Being useful was better than being seen. I took every extra shift offered: pediatrics, surgery prep, even cleaning duty when they were short-staffed. Some weeks, I barely remembered the sound of my own television. I'd come home after sunrise, peel off my scrubs, and wash them by hand before crawling into bed for a few hours. The scent of antiseptic never really left my skin. Money came slowly, but it came. I kept it neat, careful columns of numbers in a small brown notebook labeled Lauren's Future. The cover had started to curl at the edges from the humidity. Inside, each page was dated, each dollar accounted for: rent, utilities, groceries, savings. Every time I made a deposit, I wrote it down with a blue pen and drew a small check mark beside the amount. That check mark meant one less thing my daughter would ever have to worry about. Some nights, the ache in my back climbed all the way to my shoulders. My shoes were worn so thin I held them together with medical tape white, neat, hidden beneath the hem of my uniform. I told myself I'd buy new ones next paycheck. But next paycheck always had other plans. Lauren was thriving. She grew into her father's smile and my stubbornness. At school, she joined every club, volunteered at the library, brought home report cards that looked like sunlight on paper. On the rare nights I wasn't working, we'd sit together at the kitchen table. She'd chatter about her classes while I filled out billing slips or clipped coupons from the newspaper. Her laughter carried through the apartment like music, softening the edges of fatigue. Once, when she caught me rubbing my wrist after a long shift, she frowned and said, "You should rest more, Mom." I told her rest was for people who'd already built something worth resting in. She didn't understand. Not then. On Sundays, I attended Mass at St. Francis downtown. I liked the stillness there, the smell of old wood and candle wax. During communion, I'd bow my head and whisper the same quiet prayer. Give me strength for one more day. It was the closest I ever came to asking for anything. Years stacked on top of one another like the pages of that notebook. The handwriting changed steadier at first, then smaller, tighter, as if I were conserving ink the way I'd learned to conserve everything else. When the hospital installed computers and said paper charts were being phased out, I felt a pang of loss. There was something comforting about ink, about proof that the work had been done. By the time Lauren finished college, I'd filled 3 notebooks. The last page of the third ended with a single line written in shaky pen, "Down payment ready." I remember sitting on my couch, the evening light spilling across the page, realizing my daughter's future had a number attached to it, now something measurable, heavy, earned inch by inch. My body ached, but it was a familiar pain, like the soreness after healing. I closed the notebook carefully, ran my fingers over the cover, and whispered the words that had carried me through every long shift and every sleepless night. This is for her. Then I set it beside David's watch on the dresser. 2 things that no longer moved but somehow still kept time. When Lauren told me she and Mark had found the one, her voice carried that bright edge between hope and fear. We were sitting at a cafe downtown, the kind with polished floors and quiet music. A place she liked, but I could never quite relax in. She spread out the real estate brochure across the table as if it were a newborn. "It's perfect." "Mom," she said, eyes glowing. "Ardsley Park, 2 stories, wraparound porch, even a magnolia in the front yard. We could start a family there." The house in the photo looked like it had been lifted out of one of her magazine's white columns, tall windows, sunlight spilling over the lawn. I could already picture her children running barefoot across the grass. But I also knew what homes like that cost. "The bank's giving you trouble?" I asked gently. Her smile faltered. "They want a stronger guarantor. Mark's commission income isn't enough on paper, and my business is too new. We just need a little help getting through the approval." Help. The word had followed me through decades, hospital halls, tuition payments, every envelope I'd labeled future fund. I heard David's voice in my head, the way he used to say, "If you can give our girl a softer landing, do it." I'd already built the runway. I just hadn't expected to be asked to pave it again. I met Mark that weekend to see the house. He greeted me at the porch with his usual charm, his smile confident but thin around the edges. "We'll make it worth it. Evelyn," he promised as we walked through the rooms, "we'll take care of everything." The ceilings were high, the walls pale and bare. I ran my hand along the staircase banister smooth. New, nothing like the worn wood of the home David and I had shared. For a moment, I felt a quiet ache of envy for the life my daughter was already stepping into. At the kitchen counter, the mortgage papers waited in a neat stack beside a silver pen. The numbers blurred a little as I scanned them. The retirement account I'd spent 30 years building would cover the down payment. It wasn't a fortune, but it was stability, my cushion, my safety net. Lauren stood beside me, twisting the ring on her finger, her expression caught between pride and worry. "You don't have to," she said softly. "We'll figure something out." But she didn't mean it. I could hear the small tremor beneath her voice. The one that said she hoped I would. I signed my name. Once on the mortgage agreement. Once on the withdrawal form for my fund. 2 strokes of blue ink that turned years of sacrifice into a promise I wasn't sure I could afford. Afterward, we stood in the living room. Lauren leaned her head on my shoulder. "You'll always have a place here, Mom," she said. I smiled, though something in her words felt strangely final, like a door closing quietly behind us. Outside, the magnolia tree swayed in the soft wind. I imagined it growing taller with each season, roots deepening while mine, somewhere unseen, thinned a little more. When I left, the papers were already sealed in their folder, neat and official. I drove home past the river, the light shifting gold over the water. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of that house as if it were partly mine too, its porch light glowing like a beacon waiting for me. I didn't yet know that one day I'd look at it from the street and realize how wrong I'd been. The first few Sundays after Lauren and Mark moved in, the house still felt warm when I arrived. There were boxes by the stairs, grocery bags half unpacked, the kind of chaos that made a place human. I'd bring my pecan pie, still in the tin pan, and Lauren would laugh, saying, "You don't have to bake every time, Mom." Then she'd slice herself a small piece anyway, eating it over the sink like she used to when she was a teenager. But as the weeks passed, the house began to change. The smell of new paint replaced the faint scent of pie and coffee. The curtains were drawn more often, the music quieter. Even their voices softened, like people practicing a language they were no longer fluent in. When I came by one Sunday, I noticed the small things first. My pie dish was washed and stored in the pantry before anyone had taken a bite. Lauren's smile felt thinner. She fussed with the cushions on the couch, straightening them over and over. Mark sat at the other end of the living room, scrolling through his phone, the glow reflecting on his face. He looked up only once, to ask about the hospital, how long I'd been retired now, whether I was enjoying the quiet life. He said it kindly, but his tone carried the kind of distance polite people use to keep a conversation from going anywhere. "I keep busy," I told him. "I volunteer twice a week at the clinic downtown." "That's nice," he said, already looking back at the screen. Lauren appeared from the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one. Her nails painted a soft gray that matched the new sofa. "Mom, maybe don't use that word clinic when you talk about it," she said. "It sounds a little grim. Just say community center, it's lighter." I nodded, even though I didn't understand why it mattered. Dinner was quiet. Lauren talked about a new client who wanted a coastal wedding. Mark mentioned property taxes and interest rates. I listened, smiling at the right times, asking questions when I could. But the rhythm we used to share the one that belonged to mothers and daughters was gone. Every pause felt longer, every smile more practiced. When I offered to help clear the table, Lauren shook her head. "It's fine, Mom. You're our guest now." The word guest caught somewhere in my chest. I'd bought the magnolia tree that stood outside their window. I'd written the first mortgage check, yet sitting at that table, I felt like someone visiting a life I'd helped build but no longer belonged to. Before I left, I placed the untouched pie on the counter. "For later," I said. Lauren thanked me, already moving toward the dishwasher. The drive home was short but quiet. The radio stayed off. In the reflection of the window, I could see my hands resting still on the steering wheel, the skin around my knuckles pale and lined. I remembered how, when she was small, Lauren used to grip those same hands crossing the street, trusting they knew where to go. That night, I wrapped the extra pie crusts in foil and froze them for next week. I told myself she was just busy, that young families drifted into their own routines. But when Sunday came again and my phone stayed silent, I baked anyway. I drove across town with the warm pie on my lap, just in case they'd forgotten to call. By the following spring, the Sunday visits had become ritual more than gathering. I still brought pie, sometimes pecan, sometimes peach when the season turned warm, but the sweetness didn't seem to fill the house the way it used to. Lauren would open the door with a quick smile, her voice bright and practiced, and I'd step inside with my casserole carrier held like a peace offering. The grandchildren, Owen and Clara, were always somewhere else when I arrived upstairs finishing homework or glued to a tablet in the living room. When they were little, they used to run to the door shouting "Grandma" and wrap their arms around my knees. Now, if they looked up at all, it was with a polite, "Hi, Grandma," followed by the soft click of a screen turning back on. I tried to keep our little traditions alive after dinner. I'd tell one of my old stories, the kind Lauren used to beg for when she was a girl, about the night her father and I danced on the pier after his promotion, or how the wind once blew our laundry clear into the neighbor's yard. They were ordinary stories, but they had warmth. They were the pieces of life I'd hoped to hand down. One evening, I began to tell the children about the time their mother tried to bake a birthday cake at age 9 and forgot the sugar. "It came out flat as a tire," I said, laughing. "Your grandfather pretended it was perfect. He said, 'Sweet enough already,' and ate 2 pieces just to make her smile." Clara glanced toward Lauren before responding. Lauren didn't look up from her wine glass. "Mom," she said softly, "maybe don't tell them that one again." "They've heard it," I nodded, smiling though my throat tightened. Owen's eyes flicked between us before he mumbled, "Can I be excused?" I waved him off, pretending not to mind. Afterward, while Lauren and Mark cleared the table, I sat on the couch with Clara, who was still absorbed in her tablet. On the screen, animated characters danced through a bright digital world, all sound and color. I watched her small fingers tap and swipe, so confident, so distant, and wondered what stories she'd remember when she grew up, and whose voice she'd hear telling them. When Lauren returned to the room, she perched beside her daughter and ran a gentle hand through her hair. "Don't sit too close to the screen, sweetheart," she said, not looking at me. The words were tender, familiar, and they stung in their exclusion. I gathered my purse, saying I should head home before dark. "Oh, you don't have to rush," Lauren said automatically, but she didn't insist when I stood. At the door, Clara waved without looking away from her game. The drive home was quiet. The city glowed with early spring light, Spanish moss hanging like lace over the street lamps. I thought of how many Sundays had begun with anticipation and ended with silence. Still, I told myself next week would be different. Next week, maybe Owen would show me his new drawings, or Clara would ask about her grandfather. When I reached my house, I set the half-eaten pie on the counter and washed the dish slowly, my hands steady under the running water. I could still hear their laughter faintly in my ears, their voices warm and distant, like a song playing from another room. By late summer, the Sunday air had turned heavy and sweet with magnolia bloom. I decided to bring something different that week, something more personal than pie. The old photo album had been waiting on my shelf for years, its leather cover cracked, the corners worn soft by time. Inside were photographs of everything that had built our lives, David in uniform. Lauren's first day of school, the 3 of us on the front porch of our first home. I wrapped it carefully in brown paper and tied a ribbon around it. Like a gift. Maybe that's how I thought of it, something worth giving back to the family I'd helped create. When I arrived, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and perfume. The children were in the den, half watching a movie. Lauren greeted me with the usual polite kiss on the cheek. "You didn't have to bring anything today," she said, eyeing the package in my arms. "It's not food this time," I said, smiling. Something else. She laughed lightly. That's a surprise. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the conversation had slipped into small talk, I placed the package on the coffee table. The ribbon came loose with a soft sigh as I unwrapped it. I thought we could look through these, I said, opening the first page. You remember this one? Your father teaching you how to ride a bike on Whitaker Street? You fell right into the azalea bush. Lauren leaned back in her chair, wine glass balanced loosely in her hand. Oh, Mom, not now, she said gently. You've kept all those old pictures. You should really digitize them before they get ruined. They still look fine, I said, turning another page. See, here's your birthday, your 9th. I think, the cake without sugar. Mark chuckled quietly, trying to be polite. Classic story, he said. I thought the kids might like to see what you were like at their age, I continued. Lauren's smile tightened. Honestly. Mom, we don't have the space for more stuff lying around. Maybe leave the album at your place. I'm trying to keep the coffee table clear. All this, she gestured toward it. The photos spread open under the light. It's just clutter. The word hit me harder than it should have. Clutter. It hung in the air, soft but final, as if she'd just identified me without saying my name. I stared down at the photographs. David's smile looked up from the page, frozen mid-laughter. Lauren at 5, holding a seashell to her ear. The color in the pictures had faded over the years, but their warmth hadn't. Not to me. The children glanced up briefly, then back to their screens. I closed the album slowly, pressing my palm against the worn cover as though it might steady me. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. I'll take it home. Lauren reached over, placing her hand lightly on my arm. Don't take it personally. Mom, you know how I am about clutter. I nodded. I know. After a moment, conversation drifted back to something about a work client, and I sat quietly, holding the album against my chest. I could feel the faint ridges of the leather pressing into my palms, grounding me. It was heavier than I remembered, maybe from everything it carried. When I finally stood to leave, the house was glowing with its usual perfection. The children waved absent-mindedly. Lauren hugged me at the door, her perfume soft and unfamiliar. The night air felt cooler when I stepped outside. Crickets sang from the hedges, and the magnolia tree shimmered faintly in the porch light. I carried the album close to me all the way to the car, afraid it might fall, afraid it might break. Back home, I placed it on the kitchen table and turned on a single lamp. The pages opened like a quiet confession, each photograph a reminder of a life that had once been full of sound. I traced my finger along the image of David, holding a laughing little girl, and whispered, "Clutter, huh?" The lamp's glow softened the edges of their faces, and for a fleeting second, I could almost hear their laughter again, faint but alive, echoing through the silence. By Thanksgiving that year, Lauren's house had become something out of a lifestyle magazine. The porch railings were draped with garlands, the windows polished to a glow. Inside, candles flickered in glass cylinders, and the table gleamed under a chandelier that threw shards of light across the room. Even the air smelled curated rosemary, citrus, and something faintly floral. When I arrived, Lauren was in a burgundy dress. Hair swept neatly into a low twist. She looked radiant, every inch the woman she'd always wanted to be. "Mom, there you are," she said, kissing my cheek before glancing toward the hallway. "Mark's parents just arrived. Can you help me keep an eye on the oven?" I nodded. Slipping off my coat, from the kitchen came the low murmur of conversation. The kind that fills a room but never warms it. Mark's mother was complimenting the centerpiece, a crystal bowl filled with white roses and gold leaves. Lauren smiled graciously, accepting praise as if she'd been born to it. The guests began to flow in neighbors, colleagues, a few friends I didn't recognize. Their laughter swelled around me, polished and bright. I stood by the sideboard, clutching the dish I'd brought, a sweet potato casserole topped with pecans. "That looks lovely," someone said politely, before moving on to refill their wine. Lauren floated through the room like a conductor, refilling glasses, laughing at just the right moments. Mark followed behind, charming and smooth, shaking hands, recounting anecdotes about the housing market. They were a beautiful pair. I watched her place a gentle hand on his arm and thought how easily she'd learned to perform belonging when dinner was served. I was seated near the end of the long table, between two of Mark's colleagues. The china was immaculate, the napkins folded into perfect triangles. Lauren stood at the head, her voice warm but practiced. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "We're grateful for friends and family, for the blessings of this home." She looked down the table briefly and smiled at me. It was a quick, camera-ready smile kind, but not quite connected. As plates were passed and wine poured, the conversation moved easily from promotions to vacations to renovations. I added a word here or there, but my voice sounded distant, as though coming from another room. No one asked about the clinic or my volunteer work. No one asked about me at all. When dessert came, my casserole remained mostly untouched. Lauren's new crystal dessert trays shimmered with store-bought pastries. "They're from that French place downtown," she said, laughing. "Much easier than baking." The guests nodded approvingly. I smiled, too. Though I missed the quiet chaos of our old kitchen, the laughter when a crust burned. The way David used to sneak spoonfuls of pie filling when he thought I wasn't looking. Later, when the plates were cleared and the room buzzed with post-dinner chatter, I stood near the window. Outside, the magnolia tree swayed in the wind, its branches heavy with leaves that gleamed under the porch light. Inside, everything sparkled. I realized how little space there was in all this perfection for something as simple as warmth. Lauren's laughter rang from across the room, smooth, effortless, beautiful. I caught her eye once more, but she was already turning away, her hand resting lightly on her husband's shoulder as she led another round of conversation. I stayed until it felt polite to leave, thanking her quietly before slipping my coat back on. As I stepped into the cool night air, the sound of laughter followed me to the car, soft, distant, perfectly rehearsed. The following Thanksgiving arrived gray and windless, the sky a low ceiling of cloud pressing down over the city. I had baked early that morning, the same pecan pie I'd made every year since David and I were married. It had become my one constant sweetness that survived, no matter what else changed. Lauren had texted me the invitation 3 weeks earlier. Short and efficient. Dinner at 6. Dress semi-formal. There was no smiley face. No love you. Just the facts. Still, I dressed carefully, a navy dress, the pearl earrings David had given me, a wool coat against the chill. The pie sat on my lap as I drove across the bridge toward Ardsley Park, my knuckles white around the steering wheel. The house glowed before I even turned into the driveway. Candles flickered in the windows, and the faint hum of laughter drifted into the night. I paused at the curb, watching silhouettes move through the curtains. For a moment, I considered turning back, but habit is a powerful thing, and so is love. Lauren opened the door before I could knock. "Mom," she said, smiling quickly. "Come in." Everything's already started. Her lipstick matched the wine in her glass. Behind her, the dining room shimmered under candlelight, perfect, golden, untouchable. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said, holding up the pie. "Oh, you didn't have to," she said, taking it with a polite laugh. "We ordered dessert from Maison Blanc this year. I'll just set this aside." Her voice was light, but the sting landed anyway. She disappeared into the kitchen, and I followed her only far enough to see my pie placed on the counter beside 3 flawless confections in white boxes. Dinner began with a toast. Mark thanked everyone for coming, raised his glass to gratitude and family. I lifted mine too, though I noticed how easily those words rolled off his tongue, how effortless they sounded when there was nothing left to prove. The food was beautiful, arranged like art. The turkey gleamed. The sides were bright and symmetrical, every plate a photograph waiting to happen. I tried to eat, but the conversation never reached me. I smiled, nodded, laughed when it seemed right. The children sat beside their parents. Straight-backed, quiet, glancing often at screens they thought no one noticed. When the plates were cleared and dessert served everything from Maison Blanc, I found myself studying the glow of the chandelier above the table. Its crystals swayed gently when someone shifted in their chair, scattering little pieces of light across the room. I thought about how many shifts I'd worked, how many nights I'd traded sleep for security, how that light should have felt like something I'd earned. Instead, it only made me aware of how invisible I'd become beneath it. The talk turned to travel Paris, the coast, a ski trip planned for winter. I listened until the lull came, that quiet moment when everyone had taken a sip or finished a thought. It was the kind of pause that begged to be filled with memory. And I gave in. "You know," I said softly, "your father once tried to cook Thanksgiving dinner after a 12-hour shift. He forgot to thaw the turkey, and we ended up eating mashed potatoes and toast. He laughed so hard the next morning we both nearly cried." A few people smiled politely, unsure what to say. I looked at Lauren, hoping for the smallest spark of warmth. She was dabbing her napkin at her mouth, her eyes distant. Then, without looking up, she said it. "Shut up, Mom. Nobody cares." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they broke through the air like glass. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The table went silent. Someone coughed, a nervous little sound that filled the space where my breath should have been. Lauren didn't look at me. She was already reaching for her wine, her expression unchanging. Across from her, Mark gave a short laugh too quick, too loud, and said, "Oh, Lauren," as if it were a joke, but his voice faltered. I could feel every heartbeat in my fingertips. The candles flickered. The chandelier hummed faintly, and the smell of rosemary seemed to thicken the air. The children froze, their eyes wide. I met Owen's gaze for a moment, and he looked down, ashamed without knowing why. I didn't speak. I folded my napkin carefully, smoothing the creases. My hands were steady, though my pulse hammered in my throat. I placed it beside my plate, pushed back my chair, and stood. "I think I'll get some air," I said quietly. No one moved to stop me. The sound of forks resumed, hesitant at first, then steady again. Laughter returned, low and brittle, like something repaired too quickly. In the hallway, the air felt cooler. I caught my reflection in the mirror, pearls still shining, lipstick still intact. I looked like someone's idea of composure. My coat waited by the door, my purse on the bench beneath it, outside. The November wind cut through the silk of my sleeves. The streetlights glowed in a long golden line down the avenue, each one leading away from the house that now stood behind me, warm, bright, and closed. I reached my car and placed my hand on the roof before unlocking it, grounding myself against the cold metal. Through the front window, I could still see the chandelier, its light spilling across the dining room like water over glass. They looked happy from where I stood, an unbroken picture of grace and success. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. The pie was still on the counter inside, untouched, but I didn't want it back. I drove slowly down the quiet streets, past the manicured lawns and trimmed hedges, until the lights of the house disappeared from the mirror. The road opened wide ahead of me. Dark and still, my fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Not from anger, but from something sharper, cleaner and understanding that felt both final and freeing. The night stretched out before me, and for the first time, I didn't think of turning back. The highway out of Ardsley Park was almost empty, the streetlights stretching behind me like a trail of soft gold disappearing into fog. I drove without turning on the radio, the silence between the hum of the tires and the pulse in my throat enough to fill the car. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, though not from anger. It felt more like holding a thread that had finally snapped light. Useless, but strangely freeing. The bridge rose ahead, its steel ribs vanishing into low clouds. I'd crossed the Talmadge Bridge 1,000 times before, commuting to the hospital, running errands, visiting patients across the river, but tonight it looked different. Vast and still, like something waiting for me to decide who I wanted to be on the other side. The wind rushed against the car as I climbed the incline, a soft whistling that filled my ears. My chest tightened, expecting the tears to come, but they didn't. The ache was there, sharp and clean, but dry. Somewhere between the words "shut up" and the quiet that followed. I'd lost the ability to cry for it. Enough. I whispered into the dark. The word came out steady, surprising even me. It wasn't anger. It was release. The lights of Savannah spread below, reflected in the black water of the river. Barges drifted slowly downstream, their navigation beacons blinking like patient hearts. I used to love that view, the city breathing beneath the night. The smell of salt and iron in the air. Tonight, it felt distant, like watching a place I used to live in another lifetime. At the bottom of the bridge, I turned off onto the smaller road that led home. The neighborhoods grew older, quieter. The porches leaned a little. The street lamps flickered. These were the streets that had held my life together, where I'd pushed strollers, carried groceries, walked home from shifts so late the world looked hollow. When I reached my house, I parked but didn't go inside right away. The porch light glowed softly against the mist. A familiar beacon I'd left on for years, waiting for my daughter when she was young, waiting for peace when she was grown. I sat there in the car with the engine ticking softly, feeling the weight of that waiting. The pie plate from earlier still sat on the passenger seat, wrapped in a towel. I touched the edge of it and felt a sudden, almost absurd tenderness. It wasn't for the pie, it was for the version of myself that had made it. The woman who still believed she could bake her way back into her daughter's love. Inside, the house felt smaller, quieter. The refrigerator hummed, steady as ever, and the clock over the stove clicked softly. Measuring out the seconds, I hung my coat, set my purse on the table, and took off my earrings. The pearls caught the kitchen light, tiny orbs of reflection. For years, I had built my life around proving love through endurance extra shifts, late nights, scraped savings, smiles that didn't quite reach my eyes. I had believed that devotion could build a bridge strong enough for two people to stand on, even when only one was walking toward it. But bridges wear down. Steel rusts. Even the strongest beams can give out beneath too much weight. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window. Outside, the street was slick with rain, the kind that barely falls but lingers on every surface. Across the road, my neighbor's cat darted through the hedges, vanishing into the dark. Everything moved on, as it always did. I thought about the girl Lauren used to be, the one who'd once drawn pictures of our family with crooked hearts and colored the sun too big for the page. Somewhere along the way, she'd outgrown that kind of love. Maybe I had, too, without realizing it. The clock ticked past midnight. I reached for my notebook, the one where I used to record deposits, bills, plans for Lauren's future and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting careful but fading. I ran my hand over the numbers, feeling the years press against my fingertips. The next breath came easier than the one before. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. The silence wasn't a void anymore. It was a room I could finally stand in alone. When I finally stood to turn off the kitchen light, the word came again quiet. Certain. Final. Enough. The refrigerator kept humming, steady as a heartbeat. I let the darkness settle around me and walked to my bedroom, not as someone defeated, but as someone who had finally decided to stop waiting for the world to be kind. The sky was still gray when I woke. That soft, uncertain hour before the city began to stir. I moved through the kitchen quietly, the tile cool under my bare feet. The house felt weightless, hollowed out after the night before. I brewed a pot of coffee but forgot to drink it. Instead, I went to the hallway closet, the one I hadn't opened in years, and reached for the small metal box on the top shelf. It was heavier than I remembered, its lid scratched and dull. The key hung from the same thin ribbon I'd tied around it decades ago. When I turned it in the lock, the sound echoed faintly through the still house. The hinges creaked open, and the past came out with it. Inside lay my life in paper form, manila folders labeled in my careful handwriting. Corners softened by time. I lifted the first one. Mortgage. Ardsley Park property. My name was printed right beside Lauren's and Mark's. Bold and permanent. I flipped through the pages slowly, tracing the signature that had once trembled under fluorescent light. My hand had steadied their dream, anchored their house. Beneath it were the joint account statements, pages upon pages of transactions. Each deposit, each withdrawal marked with initials, mostly mine. I remembered every dollar, every double shift that had filled those lines with meaning. The numbers weren't just math. They were proof. Proof of the years when I'd been seen only as background, though my name had been written into the very foundation of their life. Further down were the car papers. The registration for the SUV, my signature again. The title in my name. I had paid the insurance. Renewed the plates. I'd done it all quietly. Thinking it was love. Thinking that being needed was the same as being valued. I sat back in the chair. The papers spread out before me like a map of something I had never fully seen. Each document was a small confession, a reminder of how I'd mistaken sacrifice for weakness. They had called me sentimental, old-fashioned, irrelevant, but the truth was here, inked in black and white. The box had always felt like a burden before, a container of obligations and proof of debts I'd taken on for others. But now, under the pale light of morning, it looked different, like armor I hadn't realized I'd been forging piece by piece. I stacked the folders neatly, aligning the edges with care. My pulse slowed. Steady, calm. The refrigerator hummed behind me, the same rhythm it always had. But it sounded different now, less like noise, more like a pulse I finally recognized as my own. For years, I had believed I was powerless because I had loved too much. But as the dawn brightened through the window, washing the papers in gold, I understood love had built this structure. Yes, but I was the one who held the keys. I closed the lid, the sound sharp and final, and rested my hand on the cool metal. The box no longer felt like storage. It felt like decision. The morning light spread softly across the kitchen table, pale and deliberate. The metal box sat open beside my coffee, its papers neatly stacked, each one waiting for me to act. There was no trembling now, no second guessing, just a clarity so calm it almost felt like peace. I picked up the phone and dialed the first number I'd written on the notepad the night before. "Good morning. This is Susan Marks," came the familiar voice. My lawyer for nearly 20 years. She'd helped me manage small things, taxes, estate details, routine documents. Never this. "Hello, Susan." "It's Evelyn Holt," I said, my tone steady. I'd like to update my will. There was a pause. The faint rustle of papers on her end. Of course, Evelyn. What changes are you considering? I want to leave everything to the Memorial Hospital Nursing Scholarship Fund, I said. Call it the David Holt Memorial Scholarship. Every cent in my account. Every asset in my name. And your daughter? She asked carefully, her voice softer now. Nothing, I replied. Not a single thing. Please make sure the language is clear, irrevocable. Susan hesitated, then said quietly, I'll draft it this afternoon. Thank you, I said, and hung up. The second call was to the bank. I'd dealt with them for years. They knew my voice immediately. I need to close the joint emergency account under the Holt and Warren names, I said. Transfer all remaining funds to my personal savings. The manager, polite but cautious, confirmed the details. We'll need to notify the other account holders. Mrs. Holt. I understand. I said, send the notice today. My hand didn't shake when I signed the transfer form electronically. Watching the confirmation email appear in my inbox brought no joy, only a quiet sense of completion, like finishing a long, difficult shift. The third call was to the mortgage company. The representative sounded young, brisk, professional. I'd like to remove myself as co-signer from the Ardsley Park property loan, I said. Mrs. Holt, she began. That will require refinancing under the primary borrower's name. Are you aware that doing so? Yes, I interrupted gently. I'm aware. Please proceed. She paused, then confirmed. The paperwork will be sent within 24 hours. Good. Send it certified. When the call ended, I looked at the clock, 10:47. The air felt different now. Lighter, somehow. Like a room after a long storm. The last call was to the insurance company. The car still registered in my name. The one Lauren drove every day. This is Evelyn Holt. I said, I'm reporting a vehicle for repossession. Lexus RX. Registered under my name. I no longer authorize its use. There was silence. Then the representative asked for confirmation. I gave it calmly, spelling each letter of the VIN number as though I were reading from a grocery list. When it was done, she thanked me and wished me a good day. Thank you, I said again, meaning it this time. The house was quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me and the distant cry of gulls outside. I gathered the signed papers and slid them back into the metal box, closing the lid with care. For years, I'd mistaken patience for goodness and silence for virtue. Now, silence was something else entirely, a language of decision, of endings that didn't need to be announced. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and opened the window. The air that came through was cool and clean, sweeping away the faint scent of lavender and old dust. Across the river, the city shimmered under the pale light of noon. Somewhere out there, phones would soon begin to ring. I didn't plan to answer any of them. By dawn, the house was stripped to silence. I packed slowly, not out of hesitation, but precision. One suitcase, one photograph, the essentials of a life pared down to what still mattered. The photograph was of David and me on the pier, the wind lifting his hair as we laughed at something I can no longer remember. I tucked it between the folds of my sweater, close enough to feel its shape when I carried the bag to the car. The air outside was cool, tinged with salt from the river. I paused on the porch, looking back one last time at the small brick house that had carried me through so many versions of myself: young wife, nurse, widow, mother. The porch light still burned. Soft and steady, I left it on. The road south stretched wide and empty. The marshes unfolded in long, flat ribbons of gold beneath the rising sun, and the Spanish moss along the highway swayed in the wind like slow, graceful dancers. Graceful. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt. As if each mile peeled away a layer of something I hadn't realized was weighing me down. I didn't rush. The drive wasn't about getting somewhere, it was about leaving right. Somewhere past the Georgia border, the scent of pine gave way to the faint sweetness of the sea. I rolled down the window, letting the air fill the car, warm and alive. By noon, the road signs read Augustine. The old city shimmered in the heat. Its stone walls and narrow streets lined with palm trees and bougainvillea. I found a small apartment overlooking the water, whitewashed and bright. The landlady, a kind woman named Marisol, handed me the keys without questions. That evening, I stood on the balcony as the sky turned to fire over the ocean. The suitcase rested by the door, unopened. I breathed in the salt air and felt the world shift quietly, gently, into something that belonged only to me. The mornings in St. Augustine began with the sound of gulls and the slow rhythm of waves folding over one another. My apartment faced the ocean, a small second-floor unit with white walls and wide windows that filled with light. I kept the curtains open all day, letting the sea move through the room like breath. Each morning, I brewed a single cup of coffee and carried it to the balcony. The air smelled of salt and driftwood, and the sun rose in soft pinks that deepened to gold. I didn't rush anymore. There was no schedule waiting, no clock dictating who I had to be. The silence felt alive, not empty. A few weeks after I arrived, I walked to the free clinic near the marina. The sign out front was faded, the paint peeling, but inside it smelled of soap and hope. They needed help with intake forms, supply management, basic nursing. The young supervisor, a woman named Alina, looked surprised when I handed her my old credentials. "Retired nurse," she asked, smiling. "You're exactly what we need." I started the next day. The work was simple blood pressure checks, wound care, quiet reassurance, but it steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. My hands, which had spent decades working for others' futures, were working again, this time for something that didn't demand gratitude. In the afternoons, I walked home along the seawall, the breeze cool against my face. The tourists came and went, laughing, taking pictures of the lighthouse. But I moved slowly, content to simply exist among them. At home, the walls began to gather small signs of life: a seashell on the table, a photograph of the clinic staff, a vase of wildflowers from the market. One evening, as the sky turned the color of old amber, I looked down at my hands resting on the balcony rail, steady, unhurried, dreary. For the first time in years, they were mine alone. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. I was folding linens in the small laundry room of the clinic when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't look at it right away. When I finally did, the screen showed a missed call, Lauren, no voicemail yet. I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept folding. By the end of the day, there were 4 more. When I got home, the number had grown to 12. I placed the phone face down on the counter and made tea. The kettle whistled softly, the ocean murmuring through the open window, as if the world outside refused to notice the storm that was forming elsewhere. That night, while the sky deepened to blue, I finally listened. "Mom, where are you?" Lauren's voice was sharp, impatient, still holding the authority she believed she had. "This isn't funny. Call me back." The next message was shorter, clipped. "The bank called. They said Mom, I don't understand. Did you remove yourself from the mortgage? What's going on?" I took a slow sip of tea. The sound of her confusion didn't sting. It simply existed, distant, like rain on another roof. By the 5th message, her composure had begun to fracture. "Mom, the account's frozen. They said all the funds are gone. I can't. Mark's furious. We need to talk, please. Answer the phone." The phone kept buzzing through the evening 30, then 40 calls. Each one left a new tone, a new pitch in her voice, anger, panic, then something that almost resembled fear. "Mom," she said finally, her voice breaking. "They're saying we have 30 days to refinance. Your car was repossessed this morning. I don't understand why you're doing this. You're ruining everything." I stood by the window, the phone resting on the sill, the waves crashing softly below. The light from the street lamps caught on the silver edge of the teacup in my hand. I didn't move. I didn't answer. When the 55th call came, the sound startled me only because the room had grown so quiet. I let it ring until it stopped. The voicemail that followed was long, mostly silence. Then a breath, a single, fragile sound that reminded me of Lauren at 10 years old, asleep after crying for her father. I scrolled through the messages, one by one, then pressed delete all. The screen went blank. The air in the apartment felt clear again, like the moment after a storm when everything smells of rain and salt. Outside, the tide had risen high, brushing the edge of the seawall. I opened the window wider and let the sound fill the room. My phone lay silent on the table beside the photograph of David, the same calm smile, the same steady eyes that had once carried me through every hard choice. The silence between us now wasn't absence, it was peace, deliberate and whole, the kind that no apology could buy and no voice could reach. The sky over St. Augustine was still dark when I stepped outside, the air cool and damp with salt. The ocean moved in slow rhythm beyond the dunes, a sound that had become the measure of my days. I wrapped my shawl tighter and carried a small lamp to the edge of the porch, the same brass lamp David had wired years ago in our first house. It had followed me through every move, every chapter, as if it had been waiting for this place. The bulb flickered once before settling into a steady glow. Its light fell across the railing and spilled onto the sand below, soft and golden against the pale dawn. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the hum of it, remembering his hands steady, sure, patient, as he'd shown me how to twist the wires together. "Always leave a light on, Evie," he'd said, "just in case." For years, I thought that meant waiting for someone to come home, for forgiveness, for love to circle back. But now, standing here, I understood it differently. This light wasn't for waiting anymore. It was for peace. Behind me, the apartment was quiet. The papers were gone. The phone still face down on the counter. The tide was coming in, brushing closer to the seawall. The sky was turning silver at the edges, the kind of light that promised a clean beginning. I sat on the porch steps, the lamp glowing beside me, and watched the water catch the first shimmer of sunrise. My chest felt light, not empty, but calm. Every ache, every silence, every unanswered call had led to this stillness. The phone buzzed once from inside, faint but insistent. I didn't move. Instead, I smiled a small, quiet smile that reached all the way to the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The waves rolled forward and back, steady, endless. When the light grew strong enough to outshine the lamp, I reached over and turned it off. The porch stayed warm in the sun's reflection, the sea whispering below. For the first time, I didn't feel like someone left behind. I simply felt home.